My earliest memory is when I was 4 years old. And we were walking down the street and I saw a piece of iridescent glass, which struck me as being very wonderful because I'd never seen something like that before. A piece of glass with different colors that kept changing. And so I bent down and picked it up and looked at it, and the colors were wonderful. And I was actually transported, that is the word. I was transported until one fine day, when I was 8 years old, my uncle, my mother's youngest brother, said to her, "You know, your daughter is very talented and she should go to art school." I got a scholarship to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and I specialized in sculpture. But that doesn't mean that I didn't take advantage of everything else that was going on. And I would come in when the building opened, and I would leave when the building closed. I would go to evening classes, to drawing classes, to costume classes. The war was over in Europe, and it was possible to get to this long looked for country. I arrived in Haifa, and then I was taken to Kibbutz Ein HaShofet, and I slept on something that was very novel, which was simply a very large sack filled with hay. And in the morning, the window was open, you had the smell of the fields and you had the smell of the hay from your mattress, and it was wonderful. I love that. I have never forgotten that olfactory memory in my life. We left the kibbutz, and we left with a child of 1.5 years, and we lived in Beersheba, and I made sculpture. That's what I did. I also painted, and I drew, and I made woodcuts. I was very happy. We lived there for more than 35 years. And the house we were offered seemed like a palace with these beautiful Syrian painted tiles and designs. Every floor was different. Very high ceilings, and the courtyard. You came in and shut the door and you were in your own environment. Nobody else, nothing else existed except what you would make in your environment. I had this feeling that dreams were a very important part of creativity. And you may not be sculpting or painting your dream, but they were a certain energy. And so I would wake up early and dash across the courtyard and start working. That was the best time of all. אם יש לי אוטוביוגרפיה, זה נמצא בתערוכות, זה נמצא במעשים של אומנות שאני עשיתי במשך החיים. עיקר החיים שלי זה באומנות שלי. My first solo exhibition was in 1955, and when the America-Israel Cultural Foundation was established, they gave me the first traveling artist scholarship in 1956. In 1962, I was invited to what was then Yugoslavia, to the second international meeting of sculptors. And that was a great experience for me. I did make a very large three-piece sculpture out of old oak wood. Another thing that happened in the early 60s was the death of a child of friends of mine. The little girl was 8 years old and she had a brain tumor and she died. So when they asked me to make a headstone, I said, yes, of course I will. And they wondered how much it would cost, and I said I would do it for nothing. And I made it, and I was very happy to give it to them. But it was difficult for them to accept it. And they sent me a check. I began thinking about gifts, about things that we give and why we give and how we give and how it's accepted. And well, this lasted a few years, and a great many sculptures. You can give your time. You can give yourself to a cause. And people in Israel know that very many of our young people have been given to the cause of Zionism and of establishing a state and of keeping a state going. Therefore, I called this whole series Offering, because that's what I felt it was, an offering. When the committee that was chosen to decide on who would represent Israel at the 1965 Biennale in São Paulo, they came to me and they saw my processions and my offerings and decided that my work must be exhibited there. I was the first Israeli to bring back a silver medal for my work. Someone close to me had been killed in the sort of ongoing war of Israel. And I wanted in some way to memorialize him, but I realized after making a series of works that all these works did not speak of death, but spoke of the emergence of life. And I called this whole group Signals because they signaled that something was going to happen. I could not get away from this idea of the landscape as an analogy to our situation. There was a big exhibition of these landscapes of the Negev and Sinai at the Haifa Museum of Art, and that was in the late 70s. It was an exhibition that traveled. The first exhibition was in a town called Scranton, Pennsylvania. I met very interesting people who told me about the geology of the area, and that the region, which is called the Lackawanna region, is an Indian name which means laughing water, and that the entire Lackawanna Valley has the shape of a canoe. And I went down into the mines and I inspected the whole makeup of the city and why the city was settled and by whom. It was absolutely fascinating. So I found that I was coming back to Scranton again and again and again. So the day I came back, I went to Haifa. And I said, this will be a very exciting exhibition, not knowing what I was going to do. How do I work? There's something that grabs me. It can be philosophical, it can be something that has to do with our situation in the country, it can be something that has to do with the way I feel, or some interpersonal experience. That is how I work. I just feel these things out and stop doing that when I feel that I understand. I understand what it is. I can see what happens, but it has only led me on to something else. I don't have these idle periods of looking for a subject. I mean, they're all there. They're all meaningful to me, and I carry them out, and they lead on to something else. The work that I did, for example, in Mitzpah Ramon, Mitzpah Ramon gets very, very little rain, but the rain that it does get was running along a line and then dropping down into a chasm and then going along, and wherever it was, it had brought some seeds and there were little bushes growing there. And I thought that my work would be, well, it would be aesthetic, but it would be aesthetic because it was being useful. It had a purpose, and it was like a channel that would channel the water and make sure that whatever rain came would drop down there and continue watering these bushes and continue this whole process. Because I felt that I personally was going through a passage as the country was. The country was changing in leaps. And so I built this passage in Tel Hai. Then my work became more and more involved in installations because
ב-84 עשיתי עבודה סביבתית בהר סדום, מעל ים.
One of the environmental pieces that I made in hard stone was really to dig out rectangles in the earth and fill sacks with the earth. And every rectangle had this sort of body bag next to it, and it went on and on. And that's exactly the way I felt about the whole thing. How I got into the political side of things, that started in, well, it's very hard to say that it started then. It became much more intense in the 80s, but Israel has always been a part of me. I was 20 years old when I came here, and the only way I could express my feelings was through my work. And though I think that during those 7 years that I concentrated on protesting the incursion into Lebanon, I think some of my best work was done. But because of the nature of the work, I lost contact with all the commercial galleries in Israel and in the United States and in London. Nobody wanted to buy my work. I said, yes, it's very strong, it's great, it's good, but nobody's going to put this in their living room. Nobody's going to put it in their garden. And this is what I had to do. It wasn't, for me, it wasn't politics. It was simply me saying, this is wrong, wrong, wrong. You must change, you must change. And the only way to to get the suffering across to people was to make them suffer when they saw my work. I really felt very, very committed and very depressed. I started making these more or less unintentional drawings. From the drawing or the painting or whatever comes a sculpture, because the sculpture is really what I am really a sculptor. And this bronze figure over here on wheels, that was the first figure I did. And then one figure led to another, and all through the 90s I did these figures first in material dipped in plaster, and then cast in bronze and patinaed white to look like plaster. And that leads us to the end of the 90s, when I had several exhibitions of these bronze figures. In 1997, I was a guest at the Cité des Arts in Paris, where I made the acquaintance of fellow guests, Lila and Menachem Tzur. Invited to their studio, I was surprised to see tacked to the wall a postcard of my favorite icon from the Santa Catarina Monastery in Sinai, the Heavenly Ladder. Before I left Israel for the Cité, I had planned to carve a series of small figures in local wood to be arranged in a geometrical grouping, but the sight of the Heavenly Ladder changed my mind about the grouping, and I decided that on my return to Israel I would make a ladder and place the figures on it. This was the beginning of my present fascination with the Middle Ages and has become the inspiration for all my work to date. In my European travels, I seemed naturally attracted to Romanesque churches and less moved by the later cathedrals. Perhaps my being a sculptor, and therefore more drawn to the three-dimensional forms of the heavy, solid, simple Romanesque buildings, made me less interested in the elaborate, almost painterly facade of the cathedrals, which barely intimated the forms behind the facade. The Romanesque sculptures, too, followed the form of the stone or wood from which they were carved. So there is this background that became alive once I had made the Heavenly Ladder. I don't think in the future, no. I mean, the near future, no, next week, no, next month. But I always have lived in the present. And I can't see the future. I don't know. And certainly at this age, I don't know whether I have much of a future. If you live in the present, you proceed as you can and hope that things will go on.
חושבת שבסך הכל, על פי הרוב, באומנות שלי עשיתי מה שרציתי. אני חושבת שזה גם דבר גדול מאוד.